I think with some further training in specific areas, they can make a huge impact. 60% of the nurses that work in Native communities are Indigenous or Native American, but they don't have a 60% voice, right?
Hello, everyone. I'm Angela Rosa DiDonato.
And I'm Marian Leary.
And you're listening to Amplify Nursing, a Penn nursing podcast supported by the Pinola Fund for Innovation in Nursing.
Amplify Nursing features nurses who are leading the way in science, policy, and innovation.
Our guests defy stereotypes, define practice, and disrupt convention.
We highlight the breadth and depth of nursing influence on society by amplifying nurses who are pushing boundaries and breaking down barriers to build a new paradigm. On this first episode of Season 3 of the Amplify Nursing podcast, we talk with Dr. Teresa Brockie, an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. A member of the White Clay Nation, Dr. Brockie's research focuses on achieving health equity through community-based interventions for the prevention of suicide, trauma, and adverse childhood experiences among vulnerable communities. We talk with Dr. Brockie about the health inequity among Indigenous populations, her crucial work in this area, and the importance of having diverse representation in the profession.
So Dr. Brockie, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am looking forward to this interview and talking a bit about my work.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what brought you into nursing?
Well, I grew up on the Fort Belknap reservation, which is my home reservation in rural Montana, and was really inspired by the work of the public health nurses that worked in our community. I saw the work that they did with individuals, families, and in the community, and I saw that they made a really positive impact. And so I admired what they did, but it wasn't until my grandmother, some years later, my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer and wanted to die in her home. And that experience, I helped care for her in her home. I had the night shift along with some of my cousins and aunt. It wasn't until that experience that I really saw firsthand the level of care that the public health nurses provided. It was beyond public health nurses. It was the community health representatives as well. They provide culturally appropriate care beyond, I think, spiritual care, I think, is beyond what a nurse does often. So it was that experience that really inspired me to become a nurse. And shortly thereafter, I set upon becoming a nurse. And I think originally I wanted to be just attain a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and become a public health nurse. That was my goal.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to work within tribal communities. And I thought, these are, they're doing great things. I want to do this. I want to be able to do something that gives back to my community. So I went to the University of North Dakota for my undergrad. I was awarded an Indian Health Service scholarship and a scholarship from the Recruitment and Retention of American Indian Nurses program for the bachelor's program. And while I went through the program, we learned a little about research, but I wasn't particularly interested in it. I was just interested in making a positive impact in my community. So I finished at the University of North Dakota. And then I set about to find a job, and I ended up in California, in Southern California, and worked at the San Diego American Indian Health Center, and then in Northern California at the San Jose American Indian Health Center. The first one as a public health nurse, the second as a community health services director, And I think that's second experience is where I was really able to grow as a public health nurse, but also as a leader of a department. However, it quickly became clear to me that I lacked some skills that if I had those skills, I could do my job. I could be more efficient at what I was doing, leading a department of 13 and developing interventions for that community.
Right.
So I applied for the MSN program at Hopkins, the School of Nursing, and I came with a plan of getting this master's degree and then going back to California for more work with that in Northern California. And I came, and it was all that I thought it would be. And I was inspired by the academic preparation at Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my first thoughts of these really fantastic faculty was everyone should have this experience, this educational experience. Everyone should have that opportunity, just because they were phenomenal faculty. And about halfway through my master's program, I realized that if I wanted, because I had made my goal of as a public health nurse of positively impacting the health and healthcare of Native people, that if I wanted to achieve that goal to the best of my ability, that it would be best done as a nurse scientist. So, halfway through the program, and then I had to negotiate with myself, because I love the work as a public health nurse, working in community settings. And that was something that I loved, but I had to give up to go to this different level. And I could still have an impact on these communities, just in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So I applied and continued on with the PhD program at Hopkins. So I got my master's and my PhD at Hopkins. So I think, and now, of course, I'm doing what I think is the best way to impact the health disparities experienced by Native communities.
Did you have many role models of Indigenous nurses growing up, or were the nurses who were coming into your community from outside of your community?
No, they were from my community. So I think there are a couple of different structures for Native communities. One is if the tribe runs the public health nursing program, they'll tend to be primarily Native nurses.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one, that the Indian Health Service runs the public health nursing program. And they tend to be non-Native. Now don't quote me on that because I don't have the data, but that's just, my observation.
Mm-hmm.
So Indigenous nurses, again, from our community, making a very positive impact in our community, especially, my again, speaking from my experience, they worked with my grandmothers. So I saw that and admired it.
Can you talk a little bit about what your research philosophy was coming into your PhD program versus what you ended up doing? Did you know that this was the kind of work that you were going to be doing when you first started, or did you kind of grow into that?
I'll go back to that, finish up on that other question, because there was something that I probably should add.
Mm-hmm.
Although the public health nurses inspired me, I didn't know any Indigenous nurses who had a master's degree, and I certainly didn't know any that had a PhD. So I will say that, and then I'll move on to the next question. I've learned so much through education, a PhD program. Of course, you learn a tremendous amount about research, but about philosophy and health disparities and social determinants of health, all of those things, I think that impact health outcomes. When I first came in, I think or when I first started the program, I made the assumption, because of the description, that I was familiar with that, especially on those kind of more negative notions about our community, around alcoholism, around poverty, around suicide, around, many negative factors. That it was like all Native people had a problem with alcohol. All Native people had a problem with suicide. All Native people had, were poor and suffered from poverty. But what I come to realize is that's just not true. Like with alcohol, more people in Native communities don't drink. And there are tremendous differences based upon where you live.
Mm-hmm.
So geography has a huge impact on health outcomes, on substance use, on poverty. So it's not about race. So it's not, you're not assigned this health outcome because you're Native. It depends on where you live.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, if you look at the data from the areas that have reservations, Native reservations, that were established during the reservation era, it's those communities that tend to be very poor, under-resourced in multiple ways. So the health outcomes are very different for them. And then if you think about poverty, there's a growing gap between the rich and poor Native because of casinos and oil. Casinos have made some people very rich, but for the most part, if you look at geography, those communities that include those reservations established during the reservation era, those communities tend to be, the poverty's the same, health outcomes are the same, and that's really where like suicide clusters occur. They don't really, at least from the data that I've seen, they don't occur in affluent communities.
Can you talk a little bit about that, the data that you collected around suicide in the Native communities?
Sure. So in 2010, the Fort Peck, Nakota and Dakota tribes declared a state of emergency related to suicide, youth suicide, a cluster on their reservation.
Mm-hmm.
And we approached them and we collected data in 2011 from 288 youth 15 to 24 years of age. I'll talk about that setting first before I kind of talk about the data. So this reservation was established in 1851 by the Fort Laramie Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a reservation within a county listed among the 100 poorest and 10 least healthy in the United States. The tribal law enforcement, again, this is at under-resourced. The tribal law enforcement of 18 police officers and 3 criminal investigators is 50% of what is needed to police this area and population, area of this size in the population. So, and at that time, which was 2011, the violent crime rate was 5 times higher than the rest of the state and 3 times higher than the U.S. rate. And nearly half of those living on the reservation live below the federal poverty level. So it's those settings. Again, these spaces were created by the U.S. government. So it is settings where health outcomes are very drastically, and not just this year. This has been from the beginning, from inception.
Right.
They were not established to provide a space where people could grow, heal, thrive. They were a place to hold people.
Right.
in 2011, we collected data again from 288 Native youth. And what we discovered from that was probably one of the highest rates, prevalence of suicide ideation and attempts that I had seen in a community sample, but similar to homeless youth living in Winnipeg, Canada, a similar rate prevalence. So high prevalence of suicide ideation and attempts. And we find multiple associations, and more importantly, we found some multiple risk factors, but more importantly, we found some protective factors. Mm-hmm. We found tribal identity. So those youth who identified more with their tribal culture, that was protective for high risk substance use. Mm-hmm. And substance use is one of the stronger risk factors for suicide. Mm-hmm. And then communal mastery, which is group efficacy, was also protective for high risk substance use. Education engagement was protective for high risk substance use. And then we found that historical trauma, as we measured it, as we operationalized it, was associated with suicide ideation and suicide attempts. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of, so we did the study. These were our findings. And then we spent maybe 10 months going through the data, teaching the community the data, the meaning of the data. So we went variable by variable through the data and talked about the findings and what they needed to do, what the tribe needed to do to address some of these factors. So once we did that, I think the group that I worked with, the community members, tribal employees who work with youth, mm-hmm. had a good understanding of the data and then could direct where we were going. And so what they saw from the data was that there was not only this high prevalence of ideation and attempts, but also the association between violence and ideation and attempts, and violence and trauma. So the direction they took us was to start early by working with the Head Start program. We've created an intervention for parent-child dyads in the Head Start program. Well, it's an intergenerational prevention intervention. Mm-hmm. With Fort Peck, Dakota, and Nakota caregivers and their 3 to 5 year old children. So with this intervention, we hope to reduce symptoms of historical and contemporary trauma and everyday stress among parents or caregivers. We hope to improve parenting and then improve children's emotional and behavioral development outcomes as a way to reduce future risk for suicide and substance use. So from that data, we've developed this intervention. Mm-hmm. And the name of it is Little Holy One. Mm-hmm. Wakaniza. It's the Dakota word for child. In 2019, we were awarded an R01 from NIH to evaluate this intervention. Mm-hmm. And if it's successful, it will be implemented across all Head Start programs at Fort Peck. And then we'll scale to other Native communities as well.
We hope you're enjoying this episode, and we'll be back with more in a few minutes after this quick break.
Hi everyone, my name is Ali Tayeb, and I am a PhD prepared RN, United States Navy veteran, and host of the RM Mentor podcast. As a nurse with a background in leadership and professional development, I created this podcast as a way to highlight careers of nurses with a focus on mentorship and what we can learn from individuals at the peak of their professional careers in nursing. The RN Mentor Podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and on most other platforms. I look forward to sharing this time with you on the RN Mentor Podcast.
When you're talking about historical trauma and you're talking about group efficacy, you said that, group efficacy is one of the contributing factors. So I'm assuming that it's the inability of the group to be able to achieve needs or wants that make them feel efficacious.
So communal mastery is protective. So it's a protective factor,
yes,
and not a risk factor. So it's a protective factor for high risk substance use. So those who are closely associated with their families and their community, and they see that as a way of success, the way they reach success.
Okay, so I was thinking about it conversely. The intervention means to encourage the group to be successful.
Yeah. So what the intervention is going to do, so there are 12 components.
Okay.
So 4 of them we've adapted from to CETA, or Common Elements Treatment Approach. Those sessions are to help parents and caregivers address their own stress or trauma. And then the parenting skills that we've adapted 4 lessons from Family Spirit, which is an Indigenous parenting curriculum. And then we've developed 4 cultural lessons from that first study on suicide. So the cultural lessons are on enhancing tribal identity, enhancing communal mastery, healing contemporary and historical trauma, and then we've added an additional component on smudging. So promoting smudging for stress reduction. Or stress management. So those are our 4 lessons. And it's a 12 component curriculum that will be implemented with the parent-child dyads.
Do you find it difficult to find funding for things that you're trying to implement in the Indigenous communities?
I think originally we were a little apprehensive because we knew we had and when I say we, I mean me with my tribal, but the tribal partners. We work together. We develop all the logic models, the timelines, and all of that. We knew we had a good idea, and we thought we could make an impact based upon the findings from the suicide study. We thought we had a good chance of having a positive impact on Head Start children, and we were excited to see, the results of that years down the line. But we, of course, have to get started. I think our first application to NIH was not awarded, and I was disappointed more than anyone because this is a great idea. This is, needs to be funded, but, it has to do with how our proposal is written. So we went back to the drawing board, we rewrote it, submitted the next year, got a really good score, and it was funded. And then all of a sudden we have this money when we had talked for years about what we're going to do when we get this money. And all of a sudden we actually have to do the work. And, sometimes it's a little daunting, but still, I think it's work that needs to be done, and we're still really excited about it. We have some funding from NIH for this, and we're looking for additional funding for. We've done also another project. We did some formative work for implementing a suicide surveillance and case management system called Celebrating Life. And we just need to find some implementation funding for that. We're hoping to do that this year, but so we have a good start with the R01 funding, and we were able to get additional foundational funding from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And that was really helpful because the work that they funded helped us improve our second application to NIH when we were funded. So that was really, really helpful.
Okay, so you're piloting the study. You're hoping that the results will be positive so that you can spread it out throughout the entirety community. Are you working in your tribal community, or is this different than from where you grew up?
This is different from where I grew up. This is a neighboring reservation community. Although my grandmother was from the Dakota tribe, from this reservation. My grandmother, my mother's, let's see, it would be my great-great-great-grandmother was from there.
Oh, okay.
So I have a lot of relatives there. And I learned while I was there, while I did my work there, I learned a lot about my own history. So it was beneficial to me as well as, the work that I did. Yeah, so I've worked with them 10 years now. And we have, a long line of activities we've done together. And looking forward to finally, once COVID is not such a big problem in that area, we look forward to moving our project forward, and of course the results. And then we're hoping to get that Celebrating Life project funded. In the meantime, as I'm working at Fort Peck in 2019, my own community experienced a suicide cluster. Or at least I changed a little bit of my direction to work with my own community. So we submitted a grant to the WT Grant Foundation, and that had to have been 2019. And we didn't get the award, but again we revised and resubmitted, and we're in one of the finalists for that grant. And then we applied for one of the larger grants through NIH. It's the Native American Research Centers for Health funding mechanism to work with Fort Belknap, and we got a good overall score. So we're really excited about that. We won't know until March if we get funded. But we're hopeful. And again, it's a package. I mean, there's multiple projects, right? So we have 2 research projects. One on doing some work around suicide clusters, understanding that, and from that creating a post-vention interventions for people who have lost a loved one to suicide. And then the second is developing a suicide cluster response plan. And then the next research project is adapting the My Plan app developed by Nancy Glass, kind of violence prevention app that has been shown to be reduce suicide risk. So we're going to adapt that, and we're going to include the 4 cultural lessons that we developed with Fort Peck into that app. And then we're going to another project. There's a training component to this funding mechanism. So what we're doing with that is we're going to develop a pathway for public health, STEM, and nursing for high school students, and then adapt Johns Hopkins School of Nursing mental health certificate program. It's a psych mental health certificate program for nurse practitioners that we're going to adapt for nurses that work in Native American communities. So that one I'm really excited about because the possibilities that nurses have for positively impacting Native communities is great. There's great potential there. I think with some further training in specific areas, they can make a huge impact. 60% of the nurses that work in Native communities are Indigenous or Native American, but they don't have a 60% voice, right?
Right.
They're not. They don't have a strong voice, and not maybe because they don't want to, but they're not prominent, I think, in the decision making or approaches to working with these communities.
Right.
I think that could change, and I think that would be a good thing if nurses were given a role in impacting or developing strategies. So, I'm excited about this work because it not only has implications for this community, my own community, if we train nurses to help meet the mental health treatment gap and meet the needs of their own community. I think a lot of other communities would be interested in their nurses being trained through that mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at the same time, I think it also has global implications. And it's not just in the United States that Indigenous people have poor health outcomes, and there are these very pronounced health disparities. It's globally, and it's the nurses that work in these communities, and it's primarily Indigenous communities. I mean, Indigenous people that work in these communities.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's like if I want to have, this positive impact on the health and healthcare of Native people, I can do that through these interventions in these programs. But I think we have to step back and look at Indigenous health on a global scale.
Speaking of Indigenous health on a global scale, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected Indigenous people globally?
In countries where COVID is not a problem, it hasn't had an impact.
Mm-hmm.
In New Zealand, there's not really been an impact because they don't have COVID currently.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm not well versed at this moment about the data relating to other communities. I think that in the United States, obviously, it became very clear which communities were severely impacted by COVID.
Has it been difficult to get treatment, or is it more of a proliferation of the spread in the community that was an issue?
Well, I think that if we take a look at the Navajo Nation and the impact it had on them, the services that were available for them
Mm-hmm.
was insufficient. The shortage of nurses and doctors in those settings is very high.
Mm-hmm.
In Navajo, it was around. It's around, at least the nurse vacancy rate is about 33%. When there's problems with housing in these settings, so there's multiple families living in the same house,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's difficult to contain spread. And then if you further look at the Navajo Nation, it's 30 to 40% of people did not have access to running water or electricity.
Wow.
And this is 2021. That's, it's these places that, again, these were created by the U.S. government that are just, the health disparities, the health outcomes are very different for people living in those situations.
Right.
And I think that's those types of settings where COVID has just been able to do whatever it wanted, and it was very difficult to contain, slow down, stop.
Right. As it had been in many communities in the U.S. that have really big disparities and lack of resources. Well, Dr. Brockie, thank you so much for talking to us today about the really important work that you're doing. Is there anything else that you would like to touch upon?
No, I think that we've primarily captured everything. I think I've talked about most of the work at Fort Peck, and now we're expanding to Fort Belknap. We talked about all the work that we're doing there, especially around nurses in suicide clusters. Well, I think we go back to Fort Peck. We just got funded an administrative supplement to look at social networks among caregivers who are part of our Little Holy One project. So we'll explore how social network characteristics of caregivers are related to both risk for and protection from suicide and opioid use. And then we'll examine the impact that Little Holy One has on the social networks of caregivers. So I've been at Hopkins for 4 years now. Especially proud of the team that we've put together and the effort that we're making to have a positive impact on Native communities.
Hello, Marion.
Hello, Angela. How's it going?
It's amazing. How are you?
I'm great. I really enjoyed your conversation with Dr. Teresa Brockie.
She was wonderful. Dr. Brockie is currently at Johns Hopkins University, and she's doing incredibly important work with the Lakota and Dakota tribes, looking at some suicide clusters that have been happening in those communities and looking for things that can help to prevent suicide in young people in those communities.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting her talking about the disparities, not only with Indigenous communities in the United States, but also within Indigenous communities in the United States.
Yes. So she pointed out to us that there is a growing disparity between the rich and the poor due to geographic location and also with oil being found on some native land and casinos being built on native land. That has just widened that gap of disparity, very much like it has across the entirety of the United States, but specifically affecting those communities that is contributing to a growing despair among some young people. You know what? The other thing too, Marion, that I found really interesting about this conversation is she pointed out that 60% of the public health nurses that attend to the Indigenous people are Indigenous. And that really struck me because we don't necessarily see that throughout other minority communities. And I was wondering how, what are they doing differently in those Indigenous communities that are supporting people in those roles?
Yeah, it's a great question. One you probably should have asked her.
Yeah, I probably should have.
But well, I'm sure you still can.
Yeah, it didn't come to me until after we got off. I feel like I have a little bit of a delay today.
Well, it's season 3. It's season 3's kickoff. So we're both a little rusty and on break, but I'm excited that we're kicking off season 3 with Dr. Brockie and her amazing work. Hello, listeners. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, check out the RN Mentor podcast hosted by Dr. Ali Taib. In an upcoming episode, the RN Mentor podcast will feature Dr. John Lowe, a Cherokee Native American tribal member who is a leading educator, researcher, and global advocate of culturally competent healthcare for Native American and Indigenous populations. You can listen and subscribe to the RN Mentor podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or wherever you do your podcast listening.
Amplify Nursing is hosted by Dr. Angela Rosa DiDonato and Marion Leary, and produced by the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, with special thanks to our Department of Information Technology Services for their assistance. Music for the podcast was created by Harper Leary. The podcast is made possible by the Krista and Rich Pinola Fund for Innovation in Nursing.
Follow us on Twitter at Penn Nursing. Until next time, keep pushing over, under, around, and through. We want to thank you for listening to the Amplify Nursing podcast and remind you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening. And if you can do us a solid, please rate and review us as well. It will go a long way in amplifying our episodes.